after I go through this sort of 1 hour little tutorial with you folks, Will's going to jump back into the call, and then we'll all be able to just answer your questions, queries, just chat, hang out, talk, talk shop, as it were, share fun stories. It's all very casual. I wasn't streaming quite as much during the day as you, I know, Will, but
Really?
yeah, it was streamed from like 10 my time through till dawn, so it was a good time.
It's good times. It was. All right, I'll leave you guys in the let's say fans of Mitch, and I'll see you guys in an hour in chat. See you then. Take it away, Mitch.
Sounds good. All right, so for those of you who are new or just tuning in, we are, of course, Encounter Roleplay, streaming here on Twitch, all things tabletop RPGs, 5th edition, Dark Heresy, Numenera, Cypher System, a little bit of Shadowrun every now and then, some Star Wars thrown in, so we like to rock lots of different systems. Today is mostly going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons. It's not too mechanics specific, more sort of on the roleplay side of things, but there should be some transferable stuff as well. So if you haven't checked us out, hit that follow button, join our adventures. We stream Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday from about 1 p.m. EST to 7 p.m. EST. This month we're proud. We finally cracked over 150 hours of streaming live tabletop RPGs in a single month, which is fucking ridiculous. The most amount of TRPGs you'll find on Twitch. So we're excited about that. It's a lot of fun, and we enjoy hanging out with chat, playing with chat. How's it going, Ziggy Zigs? And that applies equally to our little workshops as it does to our games. So check us out, Encounter RP on Twitter, encounterroleplay.com, and of course right here in our Twitch channel. So we're doing a little workshop. I call this one beginner checklists. One of the things we hear a lot from folks, for those of you who are interested, if you hit !play, you can actually play with us every Thursday. We've been running these viewer games for quite some time. They run on sort of a West March style campaign, which means you can have a rotating roster every week, new folks coming in and going, which allows for a lot of flexibility. And we like to have new players in our West March games, in our Thursday games, because we like to teach new folks. People come into our chat and they say, I've never played D&D, I've never played myself, so I'd want to try it out. And so we do get quite a few new folks, but one common anxiety or like concern that we hear from folks who have never played at all before is they're just worried they're going to be bad, which is an interesting problem to have, I guess, because tabletop RPGs, the biggest thing about them is their flexibility, the openness. You can just do whatever you want, including drink a hell of a lot of coffee. You guys are right. There was a lot of coffee involved. Will, I think, refrained from the energy drinks this 24-hour stream, and I think he said it was good. There was no crash later in the evening. So we're getting better, more professional at doing absurd, insane marathons that no one would do, like the Carolina Next. It's good to have you. Welcome to the adventure. You are a gentle Carolina and a scholar. As we get started on our beginner checklist workshop here, we'll just drink booze instead. So we get a lot of new players who say they're worried they're going to be bad at D&D, just like bad at it. They don't really know what it is. We can walk them through character creation, and that makes sense. We can walk them through what the rules are. But once you actually start into the game, once you start the back and forth between the GM and the PC, that's where they start to get nervous, because there's not as much written about how to do the actual back and forth, this sort of collaborative storytelling that RPGs are. So I put together this workshop as a way to maybe pull the veil back or make things a little bit less mysterious in terms of, what is it you actually do as a player when you're sitting at the table getting ready? What are some things that you can be thinking about, questions you can be asking yourself as your character as you move through the scenarios, obstacles, and adventures that your GM gives you. So these checklists are sort of a way to prepare you so you don't feel like you're going to be dragging the rest of the party down. You don't want to forget something. But essentially, they're just sort of like a short list through adventures and be like, oh shit, of course I should have asked about X, Y, Z, or why did I not think to do Y before, diving in. Or what have you. And then you sort of learn over time. So it's sort of a way to make it seem less intimidating, to provide some of that info for you folks, these little checklists based on different scenarios, so that if you're totally new to D&D, totally new to RPGs, you've made your character, you've got a GM, but you're worried about stepping your first sort of foot off into whatever adventure the GM has prepped. This should give you a little bit more confidence. So that's the hope. Of course, these beginner tutorials that we do, we try as best as we can to keep them nice and slow. If you guys have any questions in chat, absolutely fire them up. If I miss them, the mods will help me by repeating, shouting, harassing, and just generally bullying me to make sure that I don't miss any of the questions. And then, of course, you've got the Q&A at the end. If I use any terms, like if I say words that you just have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about because they're like game concepts or something, if I say, oh yeah, like AC, armor class, I'm sorry, you can't presume that I know what the hell that is. So things like that, I'm going to try and always stop and define or just give a quick one line as to what that is, where you can find it, so that it doesn't totally catch you all off guard. Time to Dice says, speaking of being intimidated, I was super nervous before my first session as English is not your first language. That can be tough too, for sure, especially in the world that we're living in now with Roll20, all these online groups, which is great for opening stuff up. But you never know. I was in a couple groups that were, I think, Scandinavian GMs, and so there were some accents. We had to sort of work our way around different language barriers. So it's tough for sure. So if there are non-technical terms, Time to Dice, like just English words that you don't know, let me know and I'll stop it trying to find them. Will, poutine is just a plate of glory, is really the only way to describe it, particularly from a Canadian as I am. So yeah, we're going to take a picture so that you can feel like you're not going to come off as a noob. You don't want to be like standing out as the player who's never done this before. So these things should help with that. So let's dive in. Of course, if you've seen any of our tutorials before, we always start with this really uncomfortable image of one of the weirdest Renaissance tavern parties I was able to find on the internet. Because the important thing to remember for all things D&D or tabletops is that there's no real wrong way to play. So when we say that this is a workshop, it's a tutorial, it's something that you're gonna learn, there's like shit you need to know, or you're just gonna be terrible at this game, that's not really the message that we're trying to get across. We're trying to share our experience, what's worked for us, the stuff that we've enjoyed. But at the same time, if something doesn't work for you, or you think, oh yeah, like I get like why they'd try it, but that idea sounds dumb and I don't want to do it. That's totally cool. You don't have to do it. So we encourage everyone to take whatever it is they like from this workshop, change it, adapt it, break it, throw it out, use it, incorporate it in whatever way they choose. Because there's just so many different ways to play D&D and have fun, so it's all good. And we just want to emphasize that this isn't like you need to watch these 10 YouTube videos or you're stupid and you're not actually playing D&D properly. That's not the message. Just like in this image, there's a whole lot of weird shit going on, which I'm not going to dwell on because I've looked at this like 6 times now with these workshops, and it just keeps getting weirder. One of them I like added a bunch of the arrows and stuff, and it was, yeah. Anyways, if your D&D party actually looks like this image, you should maybe consider drinking less while you play D&D, or maybe get a new group, because this just looks like it's deteriorating rapidly. But anyways, let's dive into some of the checklists, some of the things you can be thinking about to start thinking like a role player, to start thinking like a character who's predicting obstacles, who's wanting to put their best foot forward in an adventure they've rolled any dice. So this isn't really about character creation. I guess the prequel workshop to this, we do have one on the YouTube, you can check it out, that just walks through really basic character creation stuff. Actually, we've got 2. So we've got one that walks you through the 5th edition character sheet, so you can go check that out. If you want to know what all the terms mean, what is HP, what are these stats, what is a physical sheet even supposed to represent? And then we've got another workshop on like advanced character concepts, where you can take that character sheet and say, cool, that's like all my numeric rules-based data for my character. But I also want to think about like more of the history and the background and my goals and what does my character care about. So we've got another workshop on that kind of stuff, some questions you can ask, prompts that you can use to flesh out your character a little bit more than just by the numbers. So this, I guess, would then be sort of your part 3. So you've got your character, you've got your group. Let's start adventuring. So broke this down for today into 5 checklists, I guess is the best way to describe them, because they're just kind of going to have bullets that we're going to walk through and sort of unpack and talk about. So with these 5 checklists, you'll have some like core knowledge that after playing 1 or 2 campaigns, most role players will be pretty, if not entirely, familiar with just about everything that I'm going to say through these checklists. So it's kind of like a compiled list of the basic experiential learning that you'll do over your first few sessions, so you can feel like you're walking in a little bit more confidently. into that first session. So we've got an adventure prep list. So you're given like a quest from an NPC or from like a job board in a tavern or something like that. Before you just run to face the dragon, there's some things you should maybe think about before doing your task, your objective, whatever's been given to you, whatever is sort of the driving the driving narrative or objective, the sort of arc that you're on. Some things before you even really start running down the road. So we've got an adventure prep list, things to do before you step out of town, as it were. Equipment must-haves. This is just sort of a fun list of really important, mundane equipment. Most folks will bring rations and a weapon, but beyond that, it's, I've got this backpack with like generic traveler stuff because I like to live on the road. What does that actually mean? Well, we're going to talk about some of the really important and really dirt cheap mundane items in most fantasy-oriented games, and why they've got the history that they do, why they're so valuable, and we'll brainstorm a couple creative ways to use them as well. Next, we're going to talk about investigation. So one of the tough aspects of role-playing is the sort of character interaction stuff, rather than just like the hitting the orcs with the sword. So when you're missing a piece of information, like when you don't know something, like, your GM has given you, there's rumors about XYZ, the, landlord's son has been kidnapped, but you just don't know where he's been taken to. Well, what do? The GM's not just gonna, give you a grid on a map to go to. So you need to do some investigation. So how do you find out something that you don't know? Because that's something that happens in just about every D&D session. Pretty commonly, you'll be in a scenario where your characters need to go out and search for more information. They need to find out some more stuff. So we'll talk about, I think, 2 or 3 ways, just like core basic ways to go about doing that, to sort of have as much information as you can get. And then once you've exhausted those, then you can start, sticking your noses indoors and such. Combat prep, this is another big one. Things to keep in mind right before you get into a fight. Things to think about, sort of imagine the Final Fantasy whoosh. You have the luxury as a player to like very slowly and meticulously look at what the combat is going to be, whereas like in real time, you're diving into the fray. But you want to know what you're looking for, things that play important roles in RPGs, things you might overlook. Sometimes the GM will just describe the terrain. So it's, you're fighting in a tavern, and like there are going to be details that are important to the fight in this tavern. The GM's not necessarily going to give you an exhaustive description of this tavern. So there's some things to ask your GMs. Hey, I want to make sure before we start this fight, do I see any XYZ? What's the status of B? And that sort of thing. Things to think about before you dive into a fight. And then social tips is kind of the last one. It was a tougher list to make as a list. I think we got 3 or 4 bullets there. But we do get a lot of folks who ask, or who say that the biggest thing that they're nervous about or that they're unsure of is the social interaction. How do I persuade the Lord that he needs to lend us horses because we're not going to get to X location without these horses? And folks are kind of nervous about that character dialogue, whether they do it in character voiced or whether they just sort of narrate through, and they don't really know how to approach that. So just a couple tips on social interactions to try and get the most out of them, because most times when you're in a social interaction, you're trying to get something. There's something you want from this NPC. And there's some little tricks and pitfalls, things to avoid, so that the NPC doesn't just close off and block off any opportunity to get what it is that you wanted from them. So that's sort of the plan for today. I'm just going to walk you through these little checklists. This, of course, will be up on the YouTube in the next couple of days. So if you miss anything, if you jump in halfway, or if you have to leave before this is finished, you can always go back and check. And this will be there ad infinitum forever on the internet, the great archive, so you guys can come back and reference if you forget something down the road. So let's get started. So beginner checklists, adventures. So you have heard down from the mountains. Normally they keep to themselves, they stay up in these caves, but they've been rumored to be seen on the roads or in the woods, a couple sort of low-lying valleys, some merchants maybe were raided, etc. So you've been asked or hired by the local lord to go investigate, to get rid of these goblins because they are a big risk. They've already caused a little bit of damage, and the local lord just wants this nipped in the bud before it gets out of hand. So you've got this adventure, you've got this, you need to go get rid of the goblins. But it's important to ask some questions before just running off to the mountains to start bopping goblins on the head, as fun as that is. So a couple things you want to know from your quest giver or from your GM, or sort of from the world, which if you don't know any of these, any answers to these questions, you'll have to do some investigating, which conveniently will be one of the later checklists we talk about. So what are the to-dos? What are the actual objectives? What are like the positive things, the actions that, you know, the quest giver or the objective wants done? So getting rid of the goblins, or like stopping the raids. That may not necessarily mean killing all the goblins, so there could be a way to get rid of them that way. Or if the local lord says, I want all of the goblins dead, that's slightly different. That sort of changes what's expected or what's being asked of you, at least as far as what you're going to try and do. So what is it that needs to be done in the positive sense? What is it that can't be done in the negative sense? So this is your don'ts. So what are the limitations to this? Okay, well, what if the Lord says, I don't want any of the goblins to be killed, because maybe there's like a very tentative like treaty between the tribes, so he just wants them like pushed out quietly. Or maybe the Lord says you can kill them, but I don't want anyone to know that I hired you. I don't want it to come back to this town because we have this treaty. So most you really are supposed to try not to breach into while trying to accomplish your objective. So things not to do. Maybe it could be something as simple as the Lord says, you know, his fiefdom, his territory cuts really abruptly on the road, and the next door duke will not allow you on his land. So there's like literally a physical border to how it is that you're supposed to accomplish this objective. And if the goblins run across, you have the choice of, okay, like we're breaking, you know, what was asked of us. There's potentially consequences here, and how do we weigh that out with chasing the goblins, knowing that they're going to get attacked by XYZ, etc. So what are the do's and the don'ts? Pretty basic. Initial thing to think about. Have it jotted down so that you know when you're moving through an adventure, you find out more information, you start, you know, accomplishing little steps towards completing the task. You want to have this information in front of you so that if things change, which they probably will, you can like reassess and renegotiate and have a new discussion with your party. So what are the do's, what are the don'ts? Another pretty simple one. What's the pay? Make sure. So many times adventurers, you know, players, not necessarily player characters, but the player just wants to like do adventures and be cool. So they're just like, yeah, cool, we'll go kill the goblins, peace, and they fuck off. But the character probably wants to eat on a regular basis as well. So most characters wouldn't leave without like figuring out what's the pay mechanism here. Is it like half first, half after? Is it all after? Is it like a retainer kind of thing? So just like quick, simple, this isn't a complex question, but make sure you're getting paid. Or there's some form of recognition or reason for doing the work, if that makes sense. Maps are a really good one. Sometimes you can just ask the GM for the maps, or you may have to go do some research. You know, go to the local library or go to the archives, etc., to find some maps of the region to make sure that you know sort of what you're working with. It's probably used with crazy rapids that cuts through these woods the goblins are in, because that may cut you off if you don't show up with rope or a boat, etc. You know, equipment might be something we talk about. So getting some maps of the terrain, knowing where you're going to be going through this adventure, like roughly speaking, you know, where do you expect you're going to end up in the territory around you, and get a sort of lay of that land. Supplies, so ask what sort of resources can be given to you. So this kind of goes with pay, but if you're being asked to complete a task by someone, they may provide assistance or help. Nidair says, rivers are deadly enemies. They absolutely are. River crossing is probably one of my favorite types of encounters. It's one of the most like perfect template encounter that has all of these really interesting like meta concepts from the DM perspective to like build a good, complex, multi-phase dynamic encounter just getting across a river. So rivers are dope. I love rivers. So yeah, supplies. If you've been given this task by somebody who wants it done, they're hiring third-party mercenaries, which is kind of a general trope of an adventuring party. You want to see if they can offer you any supplies. You know, can you give us horses? Can you give us XYZ to help us along this? Rations? Can you provide maps? That sort of thing. And last is rumors. So this one is a little bit tougher. This is like the really cautious adventurer. So, if you're playing a particularly bold character, you may not, worry about this. But if you're playing, fairly intelligent, inquisitive, cautious, doesn't really want to get, sideswiped by a goblin arrow type adventurer, Then you may do a little bit of digging just before you leave. And again, we'll talk about investigation. That's one of these checklists too. But before you step out, to try and find out or deal with these goblins, ask around. Ask other folks, the people who live here. What do they know about these goblins? What have they heard? Maybe one of the merchants who got attacked survived. You can find from other sources. What other rumors might there be? And we'll talk about how you could do that in a little bit. But yeah, there's your basic adventure prep list. There are plenty of other or additional things that you may want to consider given the context of a specific adventure that you're on or a particular thing. Raz makes the very good point, actually, that is super important, especially for beginners. Rumors are not always true. Beware false truths. It's a great, and I'll stretch that out so that there's a little bit more room for it. Great GM tip, give your party false information, not really maliciously, but there are lots of folks who think they know more than they do in the world. Pretty safe to say that that's going to be the case in whatever sort of neo-medieval time period you're in, or modern or whatever else. There's folks who think they know more than they do, or who just like to talk a little bit too much. So you may be given information that's not essential. And this is actually, Raz, I'm glad you brought this up. This is a super basic and really important point. A lot of newer players, and even some veteran players, will over-invest or become overly attached to a detail that the GM has given them that has nothing to do with the quest they're on. You walk into the tavern, you're meeting, your contact to talk about these goblins. He's going to be showing up, hooded because he doesn't want anyone to know he's the one breaking this treaty. And you walk in, and then you look into the tavern, and there's this big half-orc who's giving you stink eye the entire night. Most PCs are going to think, oh, he's giving us stink eye because he's spying on us or because he's connected to the goblins. There's a plot reason why he's staring at us. It might just be that he's a half-orc and you're an elf. And that is the extent of it. There's nothing else to it. So don't just beware of false truths, but be careful not to... but also, if your character would be suspicious, then be suspicious. And that can be fun, knowing as a player that, you're overselling an investment with a plot point and just running with it. Same thing with NPCs. You're probably going to find NPCs that the GM did not prepare and doesn't give a shit about. But if your character, builds this relationship and really, really likes the general store vendor who's, this little half-goblin, guy who's got a monocle and he's got a funny voice. Your character likes that NPC, then that NPC can be really important to your character, and the GM has to figure it out. They've got to work that into the story. But yeah, beware of false truths when you're looking around for rumors. So that's your basic adventure prep list. Those of you in chat who've got, a bit of experience on your belt, feel free to fire in other things. You guys can be discussing these checklists as we go. Like I said, they're not exhaustive. They're not meant to be everything you need, but they're a good starting place for folks who haven't played too much RPG before. Good call, Will. Trust nobody. Trust nobody. Hashtag Illuminati. All right, so the next checklist. And again, this one is definitely not exhaustive because there is a shitload of awesome, hilarious, wacky, creative, information in Reddit, on Giant in the Playground, lots of cool forums that have a lot of really creative ways to use mundane equipment to make sure that you're not just relying on magic items. But here's some of the basics. Here's some things that, just about every adventuring pack or adventuring party should have these somewhere across your 4 backpacks. You want all of these things. So rations and water, very few people would forget that. Important to have, important to know how many days you're going to be working with, and what kind of capacity you're going to have. If you're going into a woods that have flora and fauna that are edible, then don't worry as much about ration stuff. Rope is the next one. Gotta have rope. Rope is a staple as far as mundane kit. There's probably 101 uses for your rope, whether it's tying up an NPC to interrogate him, climbing up, climbing down, securing equipment. Rope is extremely useful and really good to have. Yeah, I threw in an old school there, the 10-foot pole. We'll get to it. For those of you who've played some of the older editions like myself, it's as essential as rope in a big way. Torches, obviously, if you're going to be traveling quite a bit, then you need to make sure that you can have visibility at night. Not every character is blessed with dark vision, so you got to make sure You've got torches of some kind. If you've got glow globes, whatever source of light that you might need, torch is just the sort of catch-all for that. Some type of source of light. If you've got a wizard who can drop a light cantrip indefinitely, obviously you're not going to worry about it. Might be good to have one or two as a spare in case something happens to the wizard and you're not just stuck in the dark. But having a source of light is definitely important. A knife or a dagger. I know a lot of characters will overlook the value or the benefit of having a knife if their character doesn't use it as their weapon. So they think, oh, why would I carry a knife? It only does a D4 damage when my battle axe does a D12. I'm never going to use the knife. Okay, in a fight, you may never use the knife against, an NPC, but the knife is useful in the way that your battle axe is not. A knife can help you, pry open a small little lockbox. Your knife can help you, make a spear out of wood. Your knife can be used in a lot of different ways. It's a little bit easier to flay someone you're interrogating with a knife than it is with a battle axe. Although if you've got the dexterity to flay with a battle axe, by all means, you go, Glen Coco. But otherwise, a knife is a useful to be your top damage dealing weapon. It's more of a utility thing. Filleting a fish, exactly. 10-foot pole. This is an oldie but a goodie. Back in previous editions, traps used to be so much more fucking terrifying than any monster in a monster manual or in a compendia. Traps were just the goddamn worst because you can't hit a trap. You either notice it or you don't, and then you get shit on. So the common practice for cautious adventurers would be to always have a walking stick. You have your 10-foot pole, and you try as best you can to make it look like it's just a walking stick, and you'd never really use it to whack because you've got your battle axe. It may give you some utility here or there. Combine it with the rope, whether you're trying to climb or shimmy down a cliff face or something like that, etc. But the big value of the 10-foot pole is literally being able to prod ahead of yourself to trigger traps if need be. So tapping floor tiles to see if there are any kind of triggers. If something looks suspicious, the Indiana Jones, I need to move this bag. Rather than doing it right up close, give yourself a 10-foot buffer. It can help. It may seem silly, but the first trap that completely eviscerates your 10-foot pole, you will feel extremely satisfied for having brought in that pole. And they're dirt cheap. You can you don't even need a refined pole. Realistically, you can, roll a quick survival or just take 10 and say, I'm just going to take a second here, walk through the woods and find myself the longest sturdy looking, branch that I can carry reasonably. So satisfied by that refined pole, most definitely. Exactly. Epic Euro, touch it. So you don't have to touch it without the 10-foot pole. So it's an oldie but a goodie. You don't necessarily need the 10 feet. That was just sort of like the trope back in the day. So even just having a walking stick, advising to keep a walking stick, even if you're not a monk or a wizard who's using it as their staff. A walking stick can come in handy for things like that, which is a good way to be a little bit more cautious. Nadir says, yeah, you got to lug around a 10-foot pole. Keep a 6.5-foot walking stick. You're going to lose 4 feet, but you're going to still have 6 more than touching it with your hand. And if you're unsure what horrible things can happen to your PC when you thrust your hand into devices, just ask Will and Seto, because he's done that a couple times now. And it's been kind of positive, but definitely tense and anxiety-ridden for the better part of the session. So 10-foot pole or just walking stick, I guess, is another way to put it. Can be pretty useful. Next is parchment and charcoal. I know folks who play academic characters, whether you're a cleric or a priest or a wizard, sorcerer, you'll have your books, you'll have your scholarly materials. How's it going, Safeng? But in addition to your scholarly characters, it's useful for everyone to have just some small amount of something to write on and write with, whether it's being able to make a quick sketch of a map as you're making your way through a dungeon, so we've taken 2 left turns, gone about 30 feet so you don't get lost. Being able to write messages or leave things for other folks. A lot of utility you can get out of it, and it's dirt cheap, costs nothing. And more importantly, weighs next to nothing. Having just a bundle of parchment, and some charcoal at the ready. Warm blanket. Warm blankets are great even if you're not going into Arctic climates. I guess the exception being maybe if you're going into an extremely like arid, dry, hot place, you might not need into bandages. If somebody is in shock, NPC, etc. It's not just about keeping you warm. Think of the other ways that you could use it. Because there's lots to be done. Thanks for the tips, says Luwinian. No worries. We are here. We're gonna have 30 minutes worth of tips coming your way, and then we're gonna hang out and do some Q&A. So if you guys have any questions about this, you can stick around, and we'll field whatever questions you have and hang out some D&D and chill. All right, after warm blanket, up to the top of the right-hand column, we get flask of oil. This is another oldie and a goodie. Flasks of oil, basically it's just a flammable flask. For the non-spellcaster, great as a distraction, great to kickstart a fire in a wooden building, great if you're doing anything on pirate ships or wooden ships. Again, fairly light, dirt cheap, and you get a lot of bang for your buck as far as utility. So having a couple flasks of oil that are flammable can be super useful. Setting some type of a fuse or signal, you combine your rope, cover it in oil, tie it from a high place. A whole lot of weird creative things you can do once you start combining these mundane must-haves. But a flask of oil is always a good one to have. Caltrops and ball bearings. Some folks don't carry these. I almost always do on most of my characters, just because it's a simple, easy, inexpensive way to just have a little bit of an advantage when you're trying to make a quick escape. It's pretty often that over the course of a campaign, at least once or twice, you'll be in a chase scenario or where you're just trying to make a quick getaway, and being able to just throw the one and only bag. You only keep one of these, and when you use it, you replace it the next time you're in town. Drop your one bag of ball, get a little bit of distance to help. It may not make a huge difference, but for how little it costs in terms of weight and money, it can be easy to have. Firefly Arc asks, how much does this all weigh? Well, depending on the edition you're playing, the encumbrance rules will be different, how much a character can carry based on their strength. And the individual items will weigh different amounts as well. All of these things together aren't going to weigh a lot. I think the Iron Spike is probably going to be the heaviest, depending on how many torches or rations that you have. But all this stuff isn't going to weigh too much. And again, the point isn't to have a campaign's worth of caltrops and manacles and iron spikes. You just have one use worth for all of these as a utility emergency kind of thing. And then if you use it, then the next time I'm in town, I got to pick that up. And if a second scenario happens where, I need another set of caltrops and I don't have them, you're kind of out of luck. But you're balancing, utility. It may never come up, so you don't want to carry 2 or 3. So it's good to have little bits and options. So Harry Otter says, when you create a character, are you able to trade in items you get from your background and class and buy other things at level 1? You should be able to. Ask your GM. A lot of GMs can be flexible about starting equipment. You can also ask to have just a little bit more starting gold. I've always found that the starting gold is pretty paltry in 5th edition. So you can ask your GM, hey, can everyone in the party start with a little bit more gold, but no one's allowed to buy magic items, for instance. So you can have a cap that says you can have a bit more gold, but it's just for mundane. And honestly, sometimes I say in my games, because I don't really care as much about mundane equipment, because if players being creative, that's great. That's what I want. I want them to do fun and cool, wacky shit. So a lot of times I'll let my PCs have an unlimited amount of mundane equipment. They're only going to be able to carry so much anyway. So there's already a mechanism there to prevent you from having 1,000 flasks of oil and just being a dick because you can't carry 1,000 flasks of oil. So it's good to have some utility stuff. So ask your GM, I would say, Harry Otter, see what they say. Caltrops and ball bearings, manacles, probably one of the not as important items on this list. If you're a good sleight of hand type character, if you've got proficiency in being able to tie knots, that kind of stuff, different skill depending on which game system you're playing. But if you're confident in your rope tying ability, you might not need manacles. But if you're not, manacles are a great little add-on to have. Again, one for the party, not necessarily one per person. In case you need to keep somebody where they are. for a little while. That can be useful. Iron spikes, you can get a ton of utility out of. I've had really creative PCs using iron spikes. Usually they'll just have like 3 to 5, again, for the whole party. So if you're carrying one of these rail spikes or whatever, it's not adding a ton, maybe a pound or two to your weight. But having them can be a great way to help scaling a wall up or down, sort of spiking and anchoring in. They can be used to help like wedge doors shut. Obviously they can be used as sort of improvised weapons. There's a lot that can be done with a couple iron spikes that can be useful. Crowbar, similarly, again, this one's on the heavier side, I think, on this list. But if you don't have anyone in your party who's particularly strong, if you don't have the big barbarian or the big strong fighter or warrior, having a crowbar can help you get out of a pinch, either cracking a door open, getting into a chest or anything like that, breaking locks, that sort of thing. Crowbars can be useful. And again, they double as a good whacking overlook, I think. Again, weighs very little, costs a little bit more so than, say, torches or a 10-foot stick. But having just one lock with a set of keys to it can be useful, because you never really know when you may get something that's really important. You need to keep it safe, whether it's like an order from like the local duke or like a seal or something like that, or some mysterious artifact that you're not too sure how dangerous it is, and you don't want anyone getting their hands on it before you get back to town or what have you. So having a lock and key, nice and easy, super light, give you just a little bit more security. Obviously, it's not totally a sure thing. If someone wants to get into your little lockbox, they will. But it's good to have. It adds a little bit to it. Being able to lock your tavern door a second time can be useful, especially if you're in a shadier town. So bringing your own lock can be good. And last but not least, and again, not an exhaustive list, but this is just sort of what I whipped up, stuff that I've had on most characters or in most parties that I've seen play through different campaigns. Medieval Mike says he's used iron spikes and rope to make a makeshift grappling hook. Super good idea, because a handful of iron spikes weighs a lot less than an actual grappling hook. So if it's the difference between having plus nothing versus plus a little bit of an advantage, take that little bit of an advantage and not have to carry a full grappling hook. It can be great. So yeah, last but not least, hunting trap or snares, fishing line, whatever form you want this to take. If you're going somewhere where you're not going to be staying at taverns every night, it can be useful to just speed up the trapping or hunting. I mean, if you've got a ranger, don't worry about it. They're not going to be missing, their arrow shots left, right, and center. Having some hunting traps or snares. Again, what would you want if you were, going off into the woods for weeks at a time? It can be good. So that's our equipment must-haves. Again, you don't need to have all of these. They're just things to think about, ways that, your character's equipment, not just their armor and their weapons, can be used in really meaningful ways to help get over obstacles. Because not every obstacle will be an orc with a sword staring you down wanting to fight, and not every solution will involve just whacking the enemies in front of you. So it's good to have some variety in how you can use your mundane equipment. All right, so what's next on the list? We've got adventure prep, equipment must-haves, now investigation. All right, now when we talked about adventure prep, I'll come back to it here. You want to ask about maps and rumors. Are sort of two of the ones that sometimes are harder to get. The NPC that's giving you a certain task may not have all of this information, so you have to go elsewhere. So when you're going elsewhere, when you're trying to find information, how do you go about doing that? How do you, do I just make a roll to what do I find out? What is the thing? And then if I don't get the thing, then I'm fucked because I just don't have the information. And you're just reliant on that, single roll, all or die kind of check. You can be a little bit more creative when you're investigating. So the investigation checklist, I sort of broke it down to the 3 Who Wants to Be a Millionaire sort of tricks that you can use. The 50-50, phone a friend, and ask the audience. So here's just 3 ways to think about what do you do when your character wants to know more information and they don't have it? How do you go about finding that stuff out? So one of the first things you can do, and this is just real basic stuff for new players, that you as a player don't know that they know. So what I mean by that is, you say to your GM, oh, so like I've lived in this area, my character's lived in this area for the last 3 years. Can I roll a history check or like a local knowledge check to see if maybe I've heard something about these goblins before? Because even if you as the player don't have the information yet, the GM hasn't given you a little bit of rumor or some more details, like your character may have picked something up along the way. And there's nothing weird to ask the GM to say, hey, like, can you tell me what my character knows? And they may say, don't even roll. If you've lived here for 3 years, you get this basic piece of information. But then roll if you want more detail than that. Often GMs will have like tiers or layers of detail of information you can find out. So find out before you do anything else, what does your character know? So you've been hired by this lord, this duke, to investigate the goblins that are moving way further south than they should, out of the mountains. And there's, the patch of woods in the valleys where they've been doing a bit of raiding. And there's a tentative treaty that you don't want broken. But maybe you're really suspicious of this duke and this lord and this treaty, and you're not from here. So you want to find out, what's going on. So you ask the GM what your character knows. If they've lived here for a while, they may know that this duke is fairly new to duking. Maybe he just inherited his title, a year or so ago. And things haven't been going great. So he's kind of a clumsy leader. He's not really accustomed to it yet, not the best at negotiating contracts and deals, etc. So that may raise some suspicion. So then you start to think, okay, what else can I find out? Because there's more here. There's always more underneath what you've been told. There's always more going on. So you can phone a friend. So check in with somebody that your character knows. So it's, what does my PC, what does my character know about this information that I want? I want more information about, so ask the GM, roll for it. And then what do any of your character's contacts know? So if you've lived here for a year, you might know a bartender or two. You might know a merchant or two. You might know, a couple folks just from in town. And again, you as the player, at this point in the story, you're not going to know these people. You're not going to have you're not going to have known that shit because you just started playing. You're not going to know that Just Static has just joined our adventure. Welcome. How's it going? You're a gentle Static and a scholar. It's good to have you here. At this point in the game, you're sitting at the table, and you as Joe or Susan, like, you don't know this information, but you can say, my character's been here for 3 weeks. Give me the name of a bartender. Like, give me an NPC. Like, I would have met someone because my character's not a hermit. So the GM will say, okay, a couple nights ago you met so-and-so, and they'll give you a little bit of information about an NPC. Then you'll say, cool, I'm going to go check with that NPC. I've got a contact. I've got a relationship. I'm going to go try and use that to get some more information. So then you go have a quick talk, and one of our later checklists will be, how do you work through those conversations? You want to have a talk with the NPCs that you know, because you've got a better chance of getting something if they trust you, you've already interacted before. But again, the key thing is you don't need to know who those NPCs are as the player. You can just appeal and make a pitch to the GM and say, hey, do I know anybody in this town? If I've been here for long enough, like, give me somebody. And they'll say, okay, like the carpenter, because like your wagon wheel fell off just outside of town, and so like you had to like go and deal with this craftsman who was fixing your wagon. Cool. Let's talk to the craftsman who deals with the wagon, see what they know. And then the last piece, if you still think you're not getting a lot and there's something fishy, you really, really want to make sure you're exhausting everything you can, is ask strangers. So mind the local population, ask, talking back and forth with the GM to find out, who lives in town, who might know something, who do I want to approach in the first place. But the key difference between contacting a friend or an NPC, someone who your character already has a relationship with, the difference between that and just asking a stranger is much lower chance of success. Most folks aren't as willing to give up juicy information or details to a complete stranger that's kind of suspicious, sort of raises eyebrows. So it takes a little bit more social work to swing that. So start with the people that you know. Always ask the GM, who do I know in this town? Do I know anybody? If not, then you jump down to asking the audience. But if you do, then you can start there. Just Static says, this is a super informative stream. I got to teach a group to play soon. So this is helping. No worries. We've got a couple other workshops on YouTube, basic stuff like walking through character sheets, how to do like a deep dive into character concepts if you want a little bit more texture and richness to your character rather than just the numbers. So you can check those out as well. So there's sort of like 3 starting points when dealing with investigation, trying to find out more information. You know, what does your character know? What do your contacts know, or the people who you have relationships with? And then what do strangers know around that you could figure out? Which leads us into the sort of next checklist. Now again, this one, little tougher. I had a little bit more trouble coming up with like concrete strategies or tips that kind of apply in every scenario, because this is kind of a nuanced thing. But okay, you've decided you're going to approach the carpenter, the craftsman who fixed your wagon. You already have a relationship, so you know they're not going to be like taken aback by this stranger coming in to ask them something. But you've also only been in town for a few weeks, so they're not just going to totally like pour their heart out and give you everything that they know. Tough about social interactions, more so than combat, is that if you fuck up a social interaction really badly, it's extremely hard to reverse it. It's extremely hard to go back and fix and get what you need from that NPC. Whereas in combat, if you get hit by an arrow, you can heal that wound and go back to how you were before you took the wound. Similarly, you can strike somebody with a longsword, and then they can recover afterwards and it goes back. Yes, there's going to be obviously bad blood, but social interactions can be scarier for people. They can be more intimidating, because if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, you know, if you can't read the GM's mind and how they're trying to portray this character, then you want to make sure that you're taking it a little bit slower, so that you've got a couple different avenues of approach, if that makes sense. Punk Emma says, I was baiting the hell out of my players last week. They were instantly like, why is this guy helping us? He must be bad. 5 minutes of role-playing him getting drunker and drunker and trying not to giggle for each failed insight check. They eventually decided that he couldn't be bad after all the RPing. It ended with, they're dumb, they are as dumb as they look, get them. Sounds like an adventure I would have run myself. It's a good time. So yeah, like players rightfully get anxious about social interactions because of the high stakes, and it's hard to backpedal if you've said something or offended someone. In the same way that you can like put up your hands and like warriors will know, like potentially you've got honor codes, you've got other like weird logics that operate in combat that don't really operate the same in social interactions. It's a little bit more subtle. So one thing that I would do, and again, this isn't a guaranteed list, but ways to kind of be a bit more cautious. If you're going to talk to somebody who's really important, so let's up the stakes. Let's not make it the carpenter. Let's make it like the Duke's wife. The Duke's like reclusive wife who kind of doesn't spend a lot of time out in town in the village at all. You managed to get an audience. The Duke says, yeah, we're having a big dinner tonight, and you know, we want to feed you before you go off and deal with our goblin problem. So you know you're going to have an opportunity to talk to this wife, but you don't want to fuck it up because you might not get another chance. And you know that she's potentially difficult to speak with, and she's a stranger, so she's not going to trust you. So there's a couple things you can do before you have this conversation to try and ease into it so that she's in the best scenario possible to maybe give you something that's useful. So one thing you can do is ask around. So do the same 50-50, phone a friend, ask the audience, more information about the NPC. So again, you've got this other question mark. Okay, I need to talk to the Duke's wife. What do I know about her? I've lived here for 3 weeks. Have I heard any rumors? Do I know anything? If not, do any of my NPCs know anything about her? Has my carpenter who worked on my wagon, has he ever spoken with her? And if so, what was his experience? What was she like? Do any other strangers in town, just go to the local tavern, buy a drink, strike up a conversation with a drunk. It's a really easy, low stakes conversation. Just talk to a drunk. They are often more loquacious when they've had a couple drinks. They talk a lot more freely. So find out information about the person who you're wanting to talk to, because then you'll maybe have a bit of an advantage. Oh, you know that you should not bring up kids at all because she's been trying to have kids for a really long time and she hasn't been able to have kids for some reason. So do not bring up kids in any way because she's just going to go stone face and not want to talk to you. Things like that. So that's the first thing. Ask around, find out information about the NPC you're wanting to interact with. Devour says, cool, we're doing some PC stuff, useful to DMs too in a way. Absolutely, like you can take all of these tips in the reverse to your encounters and your interactions. So when you've got a big social interaction coming up, find out any information you can about the person you're going to speak with. The next one would be to have another reason for talking with them other than needing the tidbit of rumor or detail about your quest. So you've got, I want to know about the goblins in this treaty. That's generally not what you're going to lead with. So you want to have some like fairly light, non-threatening reason or excuse to be starting the conversation in the first place. That's going to make the person you're speaking with feel comfortable in a space that they often, are in, just interacting with strangers on a daily basis. So let's say that the Duke's wife is a rider. She's fond of horses. You can strike up a conversation. Ask, oh, I wanted to ask. I saw, there's the horse, show coming up. Yada yada. Are you involved with it this year? Blah blah blah. Just to sort of like ease into the conversation. This is kind of like, how's the local sports team or how's the weather? But in the same way as you don't want to lead with, so am I getting the promotion? You want to ask your boss, oh, so like how's your last few months been? How's your son, etc. Have another reason for the conversation to kind of ease into it, because then they're not immediately on their heels, defensive, because you've just asked a pretty heavy question. When you first get there. And this sort of leads into the next piece, which is to start with small questions. And I think this is probably the most important of these 3 tips, as far as being careful not to like irrevocably fuck up a social interaction, is to never try and ask all in one big bleh what it is that you need. Unless, of course, this is all caveated, if you're playing intelligence 6, bold, like absolutely dull-headed barbarian, throwing a lot of this out the window is going to make sense. So you've got enough intelligence that you're all trying to keep one another, to give each other the best shot possible to succeed. Then these are the things to think about. So starting with small questions, I guess another way to say this, and I can even write it in, is to move incrementally in the conversation. So rather than, oh, how's the local sports team? Yes, we're having a conversation, blah, blah, blah. What do you know about the treaty with the goblins? You want to ask for smaller pieces of information, so that you can kind of be like moving around and like building the picture that you want in a negative space by like populating the shit around it. Because again, NPCs are going to be more inclined to give you small details than just giving you the whole shebang all at once. And if at any point you've like gone over the line or you've pushed it too far, then you can just sort of stop there and you've gained some information, some movement around the space. Whereas if you just try and dive right in and then it doesn't work, you're relying on one good roll, and if the roll's not good, well, then we're not getting anything into this NPC ever. But if you say, okay, I'm just going to roll to like ask her, try and persuade her that she should tell me about like, how's the trade been to the west, which is where I know the mountains are, to see if like, have the goblins really been a bad problem? Have the Dinkelsaurus Rexes, welcome to the adventure, have they really been plaguing the trade to this town as bad as people think it is? So, and then if you fail the check, cool, she's not going to give you that, but you have other questions you can ask. Sort of break down the topic of conversation into all the different ways you may frame different questions, because it just gives you more chances, so you're not as reliant on, I've got one roll, and if I fuck it up, then I'm just going to walk away. Keep the conversation going by just moving a little bit slower is a good way to do it. So we'll tie back here again. If you want to know more information, it's the local population. And if you're asking either an NPC that your character knows, or a stranger, or a really important person, if you've got an intense social interaction coming up, try and find out as much about the person you're going to be interacting with via those 3 checks. Have a reason to strike up a conversation that's not just the important adventuring related reason. And then start with small questions and move incrementally. Rem says, to heck with using this in the game, I'm using this in real life. I mean, it may also work, who knows? You mean I can make small talk about horses and stuff to girls? Yeah, I mean, possibly. Might not always work, but if she's into horses, maybe a slam dunk. All right, so we're coming to the end of the hour. We do like to keep these workshops on the hour. We may be about 3 or 4 minutes over. So I'm going to move to our last little checklist. So this is combat checks. Pretty basic. This is just a short list of things, again, not exhaustive, things that you want to kind of have in mind whenever you're rolling initiative. Like once you're getting into a fight, when you've got something happening, these are some of the things that you want to be tracking. So obviously the most important one, the combatants. Why are you rolling initiative in the first place? Why are you actually in a fight? Did, the guard captain draw his sword and charge you? Great, that means there's probably 2 or 3 guards behind him. You know you're in a city. You know, when you walked into town, you saw there were a couple guards up on the rooftops with bows and arrows. Check the roofs. You know how many people are in this fight, first of all. Who are the combatants you're working with? What are they wearing as far as armor? What kind of weaponry do they have? Do they look like bloodthirsty, raging? Do they look a little bit more reserved? Kind of take that barometer check, just like you might with DJ Ad. Welcome to the adventure. You are a gentle DJ and a scholar. It's good to have you. So know your combatants, and there's lots of stuff. Hey baby, what's your DC? Punk Emma says, good call. So know your combatants, obviously, in a fight. Another big one is terrain. Terrain and hazards. So terrain that can be used to your advantage or disadvantage. I guess because we talk about cover next, terrain hazards more is to do with, okay, there's the river, there's a pit here, there's like literally just like a campfire. That's a space that you don't want to be necessarily moving through on your turn. Get a lay of the land. What does it actually look like? What's the space that you're going to be fighting in? Directly related to this, of course, you've got cover and lines of sight. So, you know, the NPCs or the guards that are up on the roofs, let's say they're crouched and there's like a lip on the roof, so they're, you know, they've got half cover in their bows. That's going to help them in a big way. If you've got a wagon overturned that you can use for cover to get behind so you can't get shot by the bows, that also helps as well. Devara says interactables for the environment, levers and shit to light on fire or whatever, totally. That's getting into a little bit more advanced, but definitely interactables are a way. Also doing sort of like 4-dimensional checks. So what are sort of the timelines that relates to interactables as well, but on like a basic scale, keeping this tutorial as simple as possible for new folks. Who are the combatants? What does the battlefield look like? What are the dangers or the sort of hazards on the terrain? What's the cover look like? What are the lines of sight? A big one, escape routes for both your party as well as the enemies. It's pretty rare that creatures will fight to the death. A lot of folks don't realize that because in video games that's not the case. Everyone just fights to the death and then you get a little ping of experience. More commonly, you know, the guards, if there's one left, he'll surrender or he'll run. Animals, when, you know, unless they're defending a nest or something, they may run or flee when they get to half health, not even just right when they're sure they're going to die. So knowing the escape routes, relate, try and leave. And if we know we want to interrogate or speak to them, maybe while the combat is happening, one person go try and cut off that escape route. Make your way around to block it off yourself, interact with the terrain some way, set something on fire, knock down a wagon, etc., so that you can block the escape route. And knowing your escape routes, in case an Arnold Datzenegger comes at you and attacks you, welcome to the adventure. You want to know how to get the fuck out of there for yourself. And last but not least, bystanders is an important one. And I guess you could put bystanders or witnesses. This relates a little bit more to urban adventures, but again, new RPGers can often be eager to get into fights and just get their weapons bloody. But there can be serious consequences with just being seen as someone willing to slay another person. Even if you're in the right, even if it's a bad guy, you know, unless you're fighting just like aberration monsters, it might be worth checking like who's watching while you get into this fight, or who's at risk of being hurt themselves. So if you enter into this fight with the guards and you're trying to stop the guards because they're in the process of like literally beating to death, a couple of the peddlers who are outside of one of the taverns, that, yes, I need to deal with these guards, but I also need to get to those peddlers very soon because they're about to be beaten to death. So intercepting that, stopping that from happening. Who are the non-combatants? I guess we'll put it that way. We'll write non-combatants. Persons that you need to protect. Maybe you're escorting an NPC. Maybe you are going to meet an NPC and they've been intercepted by these enemies in whatever way. So, Adrian, it's important to track the non-combatants so you know who's on whose side, as it were, in the combat. So we're coming to the hour mark. This was kind of a whirlwind. We had lots of folks asking for more basic type tutorials, so I wanted to put together just kind of a shorter adventure sessions. So we had our lists here. We did a bit of adventure prep. What are some things to ask your GM before you step off in a campaign as you've gotten a little bit of detail? What are some really important mundane pieces of equipment that can be really useful in a pinch, and how do you use them? How do you go about finding more information if you're just got too many gaps in your story or your plot and you're trying to figure out, for your character's sake, what it is they're supposed to do? Ways to go about investigation. Social tips, which relates right to investigation. How do I not totally muff my social interaction while investigating, while trying to persuade the Duke to give us horses, etc.
Welcome.
And combat prep, which I'm sure Endless Rapture knows all about combat prep. Welcome to the adventure. You are a gentle Rapture and a scholar. It's good to hear you. Good to have you, but also hear you, if I could hear you. And then we did combat prep. So that was the last of the checklists we did. And again, none of these were exhaustive. This isn't the only list you'd need, but we wanted to give you folks a starting place because we have a lot of new players in our Thursday games, !play, if you're interested. And they say, you know, I understand the rules, I read the PHB, I made my character, but I'm just nervous about this session. I'm nervous that I'm not gonna have thought of something that's just like basic that like RPGers don't forget or they don't fuck up. So we wanted to give you these kind of basics just as a starting point, as a springboard to start thinking like a role player as you get started. And again, all of this is kind of underneath the canopy of only do as much or as little of these checklists or like ask these questions if it makes sense for your character to. Again, the bullheaded barbarian may not, you know, be as tactful. He may not think to ask certain questions. Even if you as a player know that you may be beneficial to ask certain things, don't feel you have to, because you definitely want to role play the character personality, player perspective. If you're not, if you're more